Well, welcome everyone to tonight's speech titled Carl Jung and the Condition of Man. Sonja is going to be talking about Carl Jung, a Swiss psychoanalyst and psychologist from Switzerland who, if he was still living, he would be a very, very old man. He's dead now. So I think we do that a lot in these speeches. We talk about dead people. It's very exciting. Anyway, I think if you don't know about Carl Jung, you might know about Sigmund Freud. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it's my understanding that Freud sort of changed the way that people think about each other and the world that they live in. This carried on with his students, including Carl Jung. So let's find out about what Carl Jung brought to the proverbial table. Thanks. Sonja.
Thank you. Carl Gustav Jung, as Eden already introduced him, was a Swiss psychologist and the establisher of the analytical psychological school. For better understanding, that's part of the analytical psychology. He was born in 1875 and died in 1961, so he lived a long life, and he spent 50 years actively on analyzing patients. When I say patients, I don't mean clinical patients, but basically anyone who would come to his house. Jung, well, I read an interesting line, and it said, Freud and Jung were so influential and famous, they became adjectives. So today we speak about Jungian archetypes, Jungian psychology, Jungian therapy, Jungian whatever. Like his actually influence was particularly big, not just in psychology, but why he became so well known is because he applied psychology to broader cultural manifestations such as myth, religion, rites, fairy tales. He actually brought psychology closer to people in the way he interpreted human beings. Another thing that made him so famous, and for that he paid high price, was that he rejected the way scientific approach was going to since the age of enlightenment, and especially in the beginning of 20th century, which only regarded science as science, anything that was going on the line of rationality and logic. But Jung saw that actually man is not just a rational being, and we are hugely determined by our irrational or unconscious side. So we have to analyze man as a whole being, not just as a rational one. So today his psychology is a legitimate theory and praxis around the world, and there are thousands of Jungian psychoanalysts active, especially in Europe and UK and the United States, but actually worldwide as well. I will start with the structure of the psyche as Jung understood, and basically it is divided in three components. One is the conscious psyche, which I guess we all know what it is. The other one is the unconscious, but the unconscious psyche actually bears two modes. One would be the individual unconscious, and the other one is the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is a term that was particularly introduced by Jung. So what is the collective unconscious, and how Jung came to that concept? Jung put loads of effort in analyzing myths, fairy tales, and especially people's dreams. And I will explain why the dreams were so important. He had a huge and very impressive collection of alchemic books, And he also traveled to Africa, traveled to the States and Mexico, where he visited Indian tribes. So he came to the conclusion that man, regardless of where they are and regardless of time, and we can see that through the artifacts we have, tend to build similar concepts, similar ideas. So there has to be something there on a psychological basis that is unifying us as humankind. In the collective unconscious, he came to the concept of archetypes. And he was afraid that until he died, actually he was misunderstood on this point, because people tend to imagine archetypes as images. But as he said, the archetypes are incomprehensible, irrepresentable, and non-perceptible. The easiest way to imagine an archetype or archetypes, because there are many, is to treat them, let's say, like the eye is our organ for sight. So the archetype is our psychic organ that gives us the ability to perceive, to feel, to understand the world in the way it's known to us as human beings. So that's what defines us as psychological beings. But how do we get to the archetypes? Is through the symbols. So the archetype would be more generic term, and the symbol would be actually the representation of the archetype. But as the archetype is more generic, there are loads of symbols to express the same archetype. And those symbols can be anything, like the cross in Christianity, the symbol of the sun, or swastika, or basically anything. The archetypes are not just given concepts, they're modes of thinking. So actually we can talk about archetypal experience, we can talk about archetypal picture, we can talk about archetypal thinking, because the archetype is not a kind of like physical entity, it's a process. Jung believed that the archetypes were developed through many years of human evolution. So they are also changeable. But what we tend to see is, again, the symbols. We live in a world of these symbols. So going through the psychic structure, we not just share same human experiences, but we also express them in a similar way. And this is through analysis of tribes, let's say, and like back actually, let's say in the 18th or 19th century, it was obvious that these tribes could have never ever possibly have any kind of encounter. On the other hand, Jung himself developed his own theory, similar to some Eastern beliefs like Taoism and Buddhism. Anyway, in order not to keep it too abstract, like the archetypes actually we actually exist through archetypes. The archetypes are not over there, and we might be or might not be experiencing any archetypes. Our culture, everything what we are, everything the way we think is based on the archetypes. I will introduce just a few main archetypes, because there are actually loads, and you never actually define a number. So the first archetype we encounter is the ego, or our self. Jung distinguished between two selves. One would be the individual, denoted with the small s, and self as the overwhelming principle with the big S. So the self, and sometimes referred to as the ego, is part of our conscious being. The ego is not just conscious, but that's what we usually think when we say I, you refer to the ego. Um, the ego is rational, it's logical, and it's actually socially acceptable mode of behavior. But the ego is only one of the complexes. And what's a complex? Complex is just a cluster of emotions, feelings related to one archetype. So for example, if I say mother, what you feel at that moment, what's the ideas you get about that, that's the complex of the mother archetype. So for all of us would be different, but it will still revolve around the same archetype. So the ego is just one of our complexes we live through. But what Jung saw is that actually we are much more complex than that. And the ego just by itself cannot solve all our problems of being. The self, the self with big S, is actually the archetype of the wholeness. The way Jung understood it is that's the vital center of our personality from which the whole psychic structure develops. That's the central nucleus of every human being. That's the élan vital and the greatest power in one's being. Jung believed that the self is our truest nature, to which we should all tend, and we should tend for the sake of our own sanity. The whole problem, well, not the whole, but loads of the psychic problem emerges from the relationship between the ego and the self. The ego needs the self so it can fully express itself. And the self needs the ego because the self also needs to be expressed through human existence. So the relationship between the ego and the self will decide our mental state. Of course, that would be the best option for every human being, but usually it's not. So there are two negative paths we can take. If we completely lose the contact with the self, and to be more precise, let's say you can imagine the self, or like in religious terms, the self would be God. Or some other, or like in Taoist philosophy, it will be Tao. So if we lose the contact with the self, it will result in alienation, meaningless of life, depression. If we go to the other direction, which would say identifying your ego with the self, that would bring us to a feeling of grandiosity, of being immortal, of being, supernatural, and so on. The conflict between the ego and the self is actually what brings us, what takes us on the path of spiritual development. So that's actually the starting point of self-knowledge. People tend to rationalize things and just escape this conflict or just ignore it. How Jung understood it is like you don't try to repress or ignore it, you try to go along with it. You try to go along with the internal crisis. I will introduce a few other archetypes to have the picture a bit clearer. Persona, which is very, I guess you're all familiar with, it's the archetype of our self-representation in the world. It's actually a compromise we, or the ego, builds with the society. It's how we represent ourselves in the outside world and in different situations, in different contexts, like at work or with friends or with family and so on. And even though it can have negative connotation, it does not have to be, because that's the way human beings can, easily function in the world. The shadow, that's very interesting and very, again, another crucial archetype or complex. The shadow represents repressed or values that consciously we reject. They can be conscious or unconscious. Usually they are unconscious. And those are those negative traits we all have, but we try not to accept or not to admit that we do. And as every human being wants to think positively of himself, themselves, so we try to find the bad things in the others. And that's how the shadow expresses itself. Most of the times actually we project our archetypes, and that's the whole issue. We project our complexes onto the outside world and we experience them as outside things, whereas they're just our own internal processes, which we are unaware of, or of course we don't want to be bothered with. They're not necessarily negative in moral terms. That has to be clear. I'll give just some examples so it gets really clear what the shadow is. So for example, for the environmentalist, his shadow can be the fear of animals and nature. So he really fears the nature, but he is into it. And of course he cannot admit that he actually fears animals, because genuinely he really loves them. Or let's say the shadow of a socialist can be desire for great wealth, which of course he cannot admit. It's interesting that Jung, and that's why there is like individual and collective unconscious. When we talk about these complexes on individual level, you can make a parallel in the global terms. So what's the shadow? Can somebody just make an example?
I drive a scooter, but I hate fossil fuels.
No, not you.
Oh.
In terms of humanity, or in terms of like, let's say, okay, a hint, global politics. So the shadow would be the enemy, right? So we, okay, so the ego is identified with the self. That would be one of the negative aspects, right? So the ego of a country is identified with the self. So now this country becomes the greatest country in the world because, you know,
So
we
you're
have
talking about,
identified ourselves. We took the position of the self.
Nationalism?
Could be. And then,
Americans controlling the gun production in the world, for example.
well, yeah,
They have the nuclear everything. Iran is making it, but like they don't want to let them have it because then they'll have the same possibility that they have.
yeah. So actually, I am the rational one. I'm the ego. I'm the rational and logical one. So I bear the right to decide because I'm the rational and you are the irrational one. You are the evil. Right? But that's the shadow. So it would be, it doesn't have to be a single country. It could be like, you know, alliance or whatever. So the evil would be always projected into somebody else. So you have one evil, like, you know, moved, then you have another evil. There never be the evil inside of you. Okay. And the last archetype, which is like there are like two poles, like anima and animus. So anima is the female side into a man's, into male's psyche, and the animus is the male side into female psyche. So basically for Jung, every one of us bears a psychological predisposition of the other gender. So that would be all feminine psychological tendencies in man's psyche would consist the anima. At the beginning stage is represented through erotic images, fantasies, but it does not have to be. They're like, for each of them, there are like 4 stages, but I won't go into that, maybe in the discussion. But what does it mean for a male person? It's actually his contact with the irrational. capacity for personal love, feeling for nature, and generally his relation to the unconscious. So basically, if a man has well established the relationship with his own feminine side, he would also be a man who is more reflective about his own psychology. Let's say it like that. So the animus would be the male side in a female psyche. Okay, I should go quicker. So the anima and the animus, the important thing is that they're kind of the archetype of life, and they determine how we establish relationships with people from the opposite gender. For the man, it's crucial because his first anima archetype he encounters in the world is the mother. So for male, the most important for the psyche would be his relationship to the mother, and for girls would be their relationship to the father. And it's very interesting, actually. For example, when you get attracted to a person, you don't really have to know that person, right? But sometimes you just like, wow, you know, there is so much, right? Chemistry. So what Jung says, actually, who you encounter is not the other person. For the male, that would be your anima. Because you project your idea, your feeling of the anima onto this another person. So you encounter it yourself. And later on you might discover that actually, oh, this person was not really, you know, the person you imagined it was. Because actually you were not in love with the person, you were in love with yourself, with your female self. It's a bit disappointing. Okay. So, I know it sounds a bit schizophrenic, because, oh yeah, we have this anima, and we have the ego, then we have the shadow and the persona, so where am I? Well, you are all of this. And Jung called this process of individuation, and that's what like his theory tends to, that's what analytical psychology is about, is bringing this wholeness back to oneself. Of course, it's not that easy as might sound, because he says the reality of the psyche is our immediate and first and maybe the most important reality we have, because the things that we build and we experience are the things that decide actually who we are, how we interfere with people, how we think, how we experience ourselves and our being here as human beings. So that's why Jung said you start from the man and you end inside the man or the human being. Not, yeah. You don't need to look in the outside. Okay, these archetypes. The archetypes are energy charges, right? Every feeling, every emotion is an energy. So you might ignore, you might repress this kind of like, oh, my shadow, right? I don't want to think of this, I have hints that there is this, bad side in me, but I don't really want to accept it. But they will find their own way. So they will express themselves through neurosis. It's interesting that Jung brought different looking at the neurosis. The neurosis before was taken as some kind of like a mental problem that has to be solved, but he looked at it as a positive thing. The neurosis is crisis. So our internal being says that there is an issue. And from that crisis we can start to move on. For Jung, the well-being of man is to be found in the internal balance between all these these archetypes. That doesn't mean that they all have to become conscious, because then we'll go mad. We just have to accept them, that there is this side of me. And we have to be more acceptable for, let's say, the masculine and the feminine side within ourselves. We just have to listen to our inner being. He says, as long as the complexes are left unconscious, they take the form of secondary subjects and occasionally function in the role of the ego as dominants of consciousness. They can possess or inflate our psyche. So what's psychosis? Psychosis is when a person is completely obsessed by his unconscious. So what? You cannot really, communicate with that person because he is kind of gone. The other way, neurosis is just a situation when there is disbalance within the man. So actually, I didn't say much about the dreams, and actually that's very important with Jung, because and that's why he was criticized, because Jung didn't build a method of analysis. He analyzed all his life, but he did not build a scientific method, and that's why he was kind of, for a long period of time, he was kind of excommunicated from the psychological community. His only method was analyzing dreams. And why the dreams were so important? Because the dreams are full and natural expression of the unconscious. Anything else, fantasies, daydreaming, whatever, the ego will always interfere. I might have some kind of fantasies, but then my, moral conscious will say, oh, no, we shouldn't, and then we block ourselves. But the dream, Jung says, Jung took the dreams as reality. Same as the primitive people, talking about the tribal people and so on, or even in the alchemy, they used to regard dreams as reality. It's just we need to find a way to read our unconscious, to understand our unconscious, because our unconscious does not talk to us in the language we know, and it does not talk through rational terms. This is what he said, that the general function of dreams is to try and restore our psychological balance by producing dream material that reestablishes in a subtle way the total psychic equilibrium. They compensate for the deficiency in our personality or distortion of conscious mind, or warn of the dangers of the present course. So you see, you believe that the psyche, if we kind of let it be with all its features, will actually come to restore its own balance. But what we did in the modern society, we actually promoted the ego as the only acceptable expression of a human being. Because that's the only predictable aspect of us, right? You cannot predict something irrational, so let's just, shut it down. You believe that, he thought that that people in the past lived more holistic lives, and they were more nature or conditioned. So the process of mental maturation was spontaneously integrated through their ethnography. Jung thought that the myths are actually not just simple stories. The myths were developed in the past by people who lived more holistic lives. And the myths were actually supposed to serve the process of mental maturation. So when the tribe sits and they tell a myth, a story, whatever, actually people were supposed to experience that myth. That myth was real. For example, process of initiation in the tribes, right? Or like burial rites, or any kind of rites. They were meant to take a person through the psychic process. So they were they originated from man, and they were supposed to You know, they were not just simply stories to tell, but the way we perceive them, or modern man tends to perceive them, is like, oh yeah, you know, I've heard that story. So today, after all the advancements of science and technology, the humanity has moved away from the human being. And the human being is in a more dramatic condition, psychological condition, than it was during Jungian time. And especially, you know, you can see now why Jung was especially influential in the 70s and later on. He says that science is trying to solve the condition of the human being, but regarding it as a being without soul. So our society today is wholly masculine, is full of patriarchal values that have produced a world that neglects the soul. The Western tradition centers upon the ego and upon human separateness. This one-side behavior is in favor of logic, analysis, external achievement, and social hierarchy. So now, today, we build, instead of analyzing ourselves, we build enemies in the others. Instead of worshipping gods, we worship movie stars and pop singers and whoever, or money. So, the whole point is that the world has been stripped of all things that are mysterious and of all its luminosity. So there is nothing holy in the world anymore. That's how Jung saw the world. There is a brilliant quote, and he says, "When we dismantle Olympus, we turn gods into symptoms." So what does it say? When we reject God, and you know, you don't have to think of God here in simply religious or simply monotheistic, and because he refers to Olympus, and that was polytheistic concept. So when we dismantle the spiritual aspect, that will come back to us as a neurotic symptom, because we practically reject part of our own being. So I will just move to the conclusion. His point was that we cannot come into being with the world if we cannot solve our own problem internally, and that's the biggest problem we have. He was strongly against polarization in any aspect, distinguishing things as good and evil, or you know, beautiful, ugly, whatever. He took the man as a holistic being and advocated human psychic health through a lifelong and self-engaging spiritual development. He took the man not just as a rational being, but a being of many different sides. Finally, his importance is also that he brought loads to the general culture of the Western world, advocating self-introspection, spirituality, and criticism of social norms. So I will finish here.